Energy FM 105.8. Keep it locked.
As we always do on Tuesdays, and cover stories from outside the borders of South Africa. Tonight, we chat all things African rugby. That's the governing body of rugby in Africa. Newly appointed Rugby Africa President Herbert Mensah joins me from Accra in Ghana. President Mensah, it's good to have you on Energy FM and Choice FM in South Africa. Good evening and welcome.
Good evening, BK.
Let me take this opportunity, firstly, to congratulate you for being elected Rugby Africa President in March earlier this year, the first English-speaking president since the inception of Rugby Africa in 1986.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You were elected unanimously, so did that talk about or reflect how much faith members have in you as a leader?
Well, I think we're in changing times. So I think that it was a major paradigm shift. You know, Africa is essentially francophone in numbers. Certainly in the rugby world it is. So it was quite a shift to have them, the francophone countries, team up and decide that they wanted to go with an anglophone president. And I thank them for the confidence. It was quite an election. I think it was 30 votes against 1. So I think that is something that they must be hoping that some of the things that we are planning for actually materialize.
Now, President Mensah, if one were to look at the state of rugby on the African continent at this point in time, how would you summarize the state of rugby in Africa at the moment?
Well, I think you have to look at it in 2-3 ways. Don't forget, Africa are the world champions. South Africa are the champions of the world. And that in itself says a lot. Then you have to say, well, what about the rest of Africa? And we have to look at the fact that we are producing some great rugby. We see it in Kenya. We see it in Zimbabwe, in Uganda, in Algeria. We have emerging countries coming through, but the fact of the matter is that rugby is underfunded, and we have to look at ways that we can increase the funding for the continent so we can get better competitions and we can put in the structures that are needed to ensure that we have the excellence that we see in South Africa.
But President Mensah, as we speak, it's South Africa, Namibia, that seem to be the only 2 African countries at the upcoming Rugby World Cup to be hosted in France starting next month. How does that make you feel? And these 2 nations, together with Kenya, are the only teams that seem to represent Africa, even at the 7th rugby tournaments internationally.
Well, I mean, first and foremost, having South Africa as world champions makes me exceedingly proud. The number of people, and there have been others, and if we talk about 7s, Uganda and Zimbabwe have been in HSBC in the past. Going to the World Cup, we've had Ivory Coast and Zimbabwe. Other countries have been in the past. But realistically, yes, it is the 2. I think the question should be, why do we not have more slots in the World Cup? Why is it that with 30-something nations competing, that we only have a slot for 2 African countries? One are the world champions, which means that 30-something countries compete for just 1 slot. And these are some of the things that I'm endeavoring to see how we can change both at 7s level as well as in the 15s level where you go to the World Cup. We have the Olympics next year. And as you know, there's only 1 slot for Africa guaranteed. And because South Africa did not qualify through the HSBC 7s, the great Super Springbok team is now coming to Zimbabwe, which means that slot is probably going to go to South Africa, and therefore there'll be nothing in Africa, nothing from the rest of Africa. So we have to change the basis upon which it is that we evaluate. After all, from the world of football, we started with the same 1-2 slots. And it took a lot of lobbying for some of those of us who were involved in football before to get Africa to the point where we've now seen that you don't say, oh, you're not good enough, so you cannot compete. You rather give us the slots so that investment comes in. And then you see that Morocco reaches a semi-final, Cameroon beat Brazil, Senegal played well, and Ghana also played well. Great nations like Italy did not even qualify for the World Cup. So we have to change the mindset globally for Africa to get better representation.
How easy is it going to be, or how difficult is it going to be to get that mindset changed?
It's going to be very difficult. I mean, I'm very much a realist and a pragmatist. So I've come in and I've said, look, we need to clean up our own internal act. And I always find that when you are a minority, you have to set the bar higher than the majority. And so therefore, governance is at the key center of it. We have to look at internal governance issues within Rugby Africa and resolve it. We have to look at the governance issue outside amongst member states to ensure that we improve it. We've set up working committees which must be held to higher standards of accountability. We've started already within this 5-month period a constitutional review to change the way and manner in which practices are. And you can ask the question, why? Because I come from a background where I believe that sport is big business. And if sport is big business, then you must change the internal amateurishness of how you operate, and then appeal to your global bodies, appeal to World Rugby. Look at the relationships that we have with SARU. Look at the relationships that we have with the French Rugby Federation. Perhaps more importantly, look at the relationships that countries have with rugby. So individual countries are not providing the infrastructure support or the support financially for teams that are representing nationhood. So we have many different tasks, as well as across Africa where maybe it's only football or it's only something else, to make sure that rugby is accepted as the alternative sport if football is number one. For people to understand that rugby has tenets and values that are greater than football and greater than other sports, of solidarity, of teamwork, of respect, of working together. Qualities that you want children to have as they grow into society. So we're out there actually beating the drum with governments. We had meetings with the African Union and the rest to make rugby part of the curriculum. We've started the first 5 months with a bang to put structures in place so that 2024 we can look at competition structures. We can look at exactly where money is at. And then we start appealing to those sources for our funding so we can change the basis of which we can now manage Africa.
17 minutes after 6, I'm in conversation with the president of Rugby Africa. That's Herbert Mensah is chatting to us from Accra in Ghana. Now, President Mensah, talking of Rugby World Cup, last week, Monday, you visited a newly elected French Rugby Federation, Florian Grill. How was your meeting?
It was very productive. He's also a new president. And we spoke cooperation. I basically put a position that I don't adhere to the fact that we go there and because we have so many Francophone countries, they have the tendency to say, hey, we are now associated with France. I want one out of respect. I'm an African, so I will be voting for South Africa. I will not be casting the vote for France unless it is Mark Alexander says, look, we're not interested in something. The allegiances in the past have not been allegiances that perhaps better serve the greater interests of Africa. And Florian Grill is a very forward-thinking gentleman. He looks at the role of France as being one of greater responsibility, one that they need to give back. They may not have money and funding at the moment, but he wanted to work with development agencies and third parties. He was very interested in new relationships with SARU. He does not look at it as competing, but how do we work together? So I would say that Rugby Africa was now looking eyeball to eyeball with FFR, that's the French Rugby Federation, and that was positive. We came up with a lot of areas of common agreement, which after the World Cup we will try and tie down.
Now, over 1,200 African nationals play rugby in France. Is that perhaps part of the reason that initiated this meeting? And also, is there a way that the French Rugby Federation can assist the development of rugby in Africa as far as both genders are concerned. For example, the NBA has already begun its development of basketball in Africa.
Well, I think so, very much so. And if I take the last point that you made, the world has changed. Look, I think if we look, and I always say, we talk about 1,200 players in France. What about the 1.3 billion people on the continent of Africa? What about some of the greatest UFC fighters? African. What about some of the greatest footballers? African. The French national team is full of so many people of African heritage. Manuel Toji and the rest of the RFU are also from African descent. NBA African. I contend that the greatest sportsmen on earth, a lot of them emanate from Africa. So if they had the investment, if they had the investment to Africa, you would see better play. And if you are looking at sport as a business, surely you want to invest in 1.3 billion people, knowing that you will make your money back quicker. After all, they say 2020 by 2050 or a little bit later, 43% of the world's youthful market may emanate from Africa. That is the new growth market of people who are techie savvy, who can spend $1, 1 rand, 1 naira, 1 something on a product. Whereas they are dealing in markets that are aging. The people are older, they're aging, people having smaller families. I'm contending that if you want to see excellence, if you really look at the Springboks, for example, and you see the greatness of any of the players, but I have to defer to your extraordinary captain and say, that surely is a symbol that somebody switches on the television today and watches. Look, I just came from the UK where I attended strategic meetings with World Rugby, and they took us into a room. The name of the room, the Kolisi Suite. So,
wow.
You know, that was in London. That was in London, the Kolisi Suite. You know, I was in Paris, and there were symbols of the world champion South Africa, and of obviously Sia is the name that is on people's lips for the leadership, the humility, and what he encompasses for the whole continent of Africa.
Wow. 21 after 6. I am in conversation with Herbert Mensah, who is the president of Rugby Africa. Are we likely, and how far are we? If not, how soon can we see some sort of an African rugby tournament? I'm looking at 54 of Africa's nations, all have national football teams, but not all of them have rugby national teams.
That's very true. We have 37 odd countries, approximately, who are registered and affiliated to Rugby Africa. Building blocks start from somewhere. We have managed to get rugby admitted into the Africa Games, which take place in Ghana next year, from March 8th to the 24th. So rugby is, and I hope that nations will fund teams to come and take part in it. It starts from there, of which we can have tournaments going through at that point. We're looking at different competition structures, but BK, let me tell you, in all honesty, and I'm trying to be as transparent as I can be, we receive about $2.3 million from World Rugby a year for 30-something nations. That's all. So what kind of competitions can you do for that when maybe the cost of flying from Dakar to Joburg or Cape Town or to Madagascar is double the price of going from Joburg to London? So our internals within Africa of cost, of movement, no single hotel group, no single television group that you can go for and deal with television rights, because 2/3 of the continent may be French, and they need Canal Horizon, Canal Plus, and then we have the Anglophone, and we are dealing in markets where people who play rugby don't have a lot of money. Not everybody has SuperSport, and SuperSport is not covering maybe all the tournaments that we are involved in. So the complexities of actually planning growth is far more difficult than if you are in a singular area. So we are considering, do you deal just in SADC? Do we do competitions for the elite nations, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Uganda, Madagascar, Algeria? How do we make these things work in a country where you don't have one airline that is moving all over the place, of which you can get sponsorship from those airlines or hotel groups, against the background that you only have 2.2 million? So we're in the mobile 2.3. So we're now in the process of coming with a completely different business model. It's been 5 months. We've come up with a different strategic plan. And the objective, apart from now shining the outer side to make sure we look good for money, we look good for capital, is to go out now and we're dealing with the low-hanging fruit. Governments get themselves involved. And 7 or 8 countries have understood that they need to get involved. So that begins to change the way. Look at competition models tied into those areas where we can look at generating money based upon that. Whether we now need to look at Africa regionally from Western Bloc, Eastern Bloc, Central Bloc, Southern Bloc, Northern Bloc, simply because cost does not allow us to have a 37-man competition. On top of that, rugby is such a technical and beautiful game. You have to be very careful that you don't have a Springbok development side or Kenya playing against Togo or a smaller nation or Ghana or a smaller nation where it could be injurious. So you have to create leagues and divisions based and then look at the models and look at how much money you have and decide what is the way forward. Because if you push the whole continent, you'll get nobody for the World Cup. If you push just the elite, then the small countries will never play rugby. So we need to understand that sport is big business. $2.something million into 37 nations against those transport costs, hotel costs, etc. simply does not work. And that's what we come to meet, which is why we're changing the structures to hopefully make sure that 2024, 2025, we have got a different basis to move forward.
President Mensah, as we wrap up our chat, you have played rugby, right?
Yes, when I'm now 63, but when I was young, I played rugby.
All right. I was looking at your pictures, your body structure, and I'm just going to make a wild guess here. I see somebody who played as a lock, if not as a lock in the mold of your Vita midfield. I see a prop, if not a lock. I see an 8th man, if not an 8th man, a fullback.
Well, I wish I'd taken a bet with you because then I could take all your money. That would be fantastic. I know I played rugby when I was young. I played provincial in the UK. When they played provincial, now they stopped playing. So out of university, I played provincial. Then I was transferred to Zimbabwe. I played there. I played Mashonaland when they were exceptionally good in those days. I'm not saying they're not now, but the standard is very high. Then I came through to the UK for one season. I played Saracens. Yes, I played Saracens first. So but I played actually in the wing 3/4. So I was part of what we called at Saracens the Fatties Club. I was playing at 120 kilos on the wing, and my other winger, Lawrence Smith, was playing at 125 kilos. That was the biggest wing 3/4 in English rugby in those days.
I hope soon, maybe when you have time, we could play a bit of touch rugby. Let me be your scrum half, your fly half. I could do that with relative ease.
And it will be a great pleasure. It will be a great pleasure.
President Mensah, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much, and all the best for all that you're working on, this project Rugby Africa, and all the great initiatives that you're going to be putting into place to put rugby, particularly in Africa, where it deserves vis-a-vis the whole world.
No, thank you very much. And I'd just like to wish the best of luck to the Springboks and to Namibia. But I think Mark Alexander is doing an extraordinary job. And I look at that team of some extraordinary talent. I look at the systems that your coaches have put together. This could be the most exciting World Cup ever. And we are there supporting both teams, but obviously we are supporting the Springboks first.
Thank you so much, President Mensah, for your time.
Thank you.
28 minutes after 6. Up next.